Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Will, I almost thought you had a turkey behind you, but then I remembered who you are and noticed that is indeed a duck.
Damn it, I knew I needed to blur my background.
You asked me, should I blur my background? I was like, no, why don't you just leave it? Why don't we just leave it?
Well,
that way, if we do have somebody jump on our YouTube to watch us in this and look at how silly we look, they can admire the lack of turkeys in your background.
All 5 of them. Well, I was debating whether or not to blur it, but, the algorithm that whatever Zoom uses to figure out what's you and what's your background couldn't decide about my microphone.
Yeah.
And so it kept making me look like I was missing half my jaw.
Yeah.
And I didn't want, our 5 YouTube followers to see that either.
Yeah. No, we have 6.
I need all.
My mom.
Okay.
My mom got on YouTube.
Well, I need all the help I can get with looking better. So, it is what it is.
Yeah. No, I thought that was funny when we had Craig on recently and he immediately keyed in on the bear in the background. So,
but I think you just recording that sound room is an excuse not to have turkeys behind you.
Yeah, that's what we're gonna say.
It would mess with the acoustics of the room, right?
Yeah, feathers actually they really do dampen the thing. I wanted my voice to be crisp for this one. So, well, I have kind of a general opening question for you. We had 3 people who are all very well respected turkey people. They're serving a little bit different role, at least Adam does, but all of them are big voices, important namesakes in the field. And we really wanted to get at this question of season frameworks and harvests, and whether or not that is leading to some of the declines that we've been seeing, some of these symptoms, or at least in some places. I was curious from your perspective, do you think that we have settled that?
Just going straight to it, right?
Yeah.
No, I feel like, so where I was at on the effects of season date, and particularly, whether or not starting early relative to nesting is a major influencing factor on the declines in productivity, was, maybe before we had these podcasts, I left the door kind of halfway open to that. Like I thought, especially Mike has made some very convincing arguments in that regard. I'm a habitat guy. I always go back to habitat. So, that's been a factor that has been at the forefront of my mind, as well as all these others, all these other potential things, like some of which we've already talked about in previous podcasts, predation. Others we'll get to, such as disease and things of that nature. But it's hard not to look at the data that was presented to us from, 2 different studies that were specifically designed to try to address this question. And then Mike even mentioned that he had some data that kind of indirectly addressed that from Georgia. And it's, in light of that, not to see that door in my mind closing a little bit further, that this is becoming less plausible.
Yeah. Well, it definitely, for me, brought up some questions that I had not been thinking of. And maybe that's one thing we should try to illuminate here. One thing that, as practicing scientists, one thing that's not necessarily as obvious to those folks that don't do this for a living is it's very hard to have certainty on anything.
Yes.
And even when we feel certain about something, we start to realize how weak that can be, especially when something, new data is presented that makes us rethink the way that we were thinking about it. And I think that's kind
Right.
of, I want to caveat with that I have plenty of those kinds of things in my research program and know them well, where I had a really clear idea of how things work,
Yeah.
and then I
Yeah.
figure out later when we get more data that that's not true, and uh,
Right.
or that it was a different mechanism or something like that. And I think that's kind of what came from this for me, with
Yeah.
all of these folks that are very knowledgeable about this, is there's still enough uncertainty that
Yeah.
we're not sure about the mechanisms. So,
Yeah. And I think I was actually, pondering about this on the way back over here from lunch, coming back to the office, just driving in my truck, turn the radio off to pontificate, if you will, for a little bit. That's when I do some of my best thinking. And that's not saying much, but
yeah,
it's better than
I'm gonna
normal
let you
at
have
that
that one.
time.
I'm gonna just let you go with it.
But I guess where I'm at as far as the bottom line is I think that there's still enough uncertainty that more research is needed and justified. And if I had the opportunity to design a project specifically addressing this issue, I think it is warranted.
Yeah,
I think there's still enough plausibility there and uncertainty there that the work needs to continue. It's
yeah,
not totally settled. Although, like I said earlier, I think I've seen enough so far to start, tipping the
hmm
scales in a different direction.
yeah. Well, after particularly Adams' uh, stuff, they and he acknowledged, that it's still preliminary, and we need to all keep that in mind, because sometimes things change. You get a little extra data, or you change the way that you need to analyze it, or whatever, and things can change. But that's a long-term experiment that's pretty well
Hmm.
done. I
Yeah.
mean, you have a really strong design there, and it's not the typical metrics that we are using to quantify productivity, but I would have expected after 4 years of manipulating the season dates on a WMA, where the or multiple WMAs, I should say, where the hunting pressure is probably pretty high.
Hmm.
I would have expected to see some movement there.
Yeah. And I've got a couple notes here. So they did not record changes related to the number of turkeys encountered, the catch per unit effort. So basically, how much hunters have to hunt in order to
Yeah,
harvest a bird, or in Jake encounters.
yeah.
I don't know if they recorded any more response variables than that, but
Well,
I noted those that they saw
yeah,
no
he was
responses.
definitely really clear on those, and especially the Jake data. I think is pretty telling. I mean, that's a pretty good
Hmm.
indication, that you're not seeing a difference in recruitment.
Yeah. Right.
So to me, I would have expected a few things. If the seizing date, coupled with high harvest rate, where we're killing a lot of the birds really early relative to,
Before Nestor
yeah,
started.
and that was disrupting it and delaying it. I was kind of struggling with, why would we not immediately see,
Hmm.
like, okay, we have a bunch of mature gobblers that are dominating the breeding, and I can see where taking them out could interrupt that, and the hen has to
Hmm.
reassess, and that delaying her to a little bit later.
Hmm.
The One of the recent papers that actually just came out where we had access to it suggests that might be up to a week,
Hmm.
at least within that,
Yeah.
what they were looking at in that one. Uh, why wouldn't that just change back if you didn't? So, in other words, if the mechanism is, okay, we've got a bunch of gobblers that are competing for the hens, and then they've established who's going to do what, and you remove them, and that immediately causes this delay. But I don't see
Hmm.
why, if okay, let's change the season dates, and now that didn't happen this year, as long as there's mature gobblers, that
Yeah.
to me, essentially what would happen then is, okay, the gobblers don't get interrupted, and then the hens don't get delayed, and you should
Hmm.
immediately see that correct, I would think.
Right, right. I would agree. I can't really think of an explanation as to why it would take, I mean, maybe I don't know. It seems like it would be immediate, but like in Mississippi, Adam was saying that they've monitored that population for 4 years,
Yeah.
you know, and they still haven't seen anything.
Well, and
And
in four
then,
years, if the majority of the breeding is being done by 2 or 3 or even 4-year-old birds, you should even. I mean, you basically have a whole turnover of the breeding stock
yeah,
in that
in
time.
a hunted population, exactly. That's what I was thinking too. In a hunted population on a wildlife management area, you would expect over a 4-year time span, most of that population has turned over.
Mm-hmm.
So they were never exposed to the earlier season date. Now, the one caveat that I will mention related to that work that was implemented in Mississippi is they only shifted the season date back to April 1st.
Yeah.
And that's still, a couple of weeks before most hens start nesting,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't in alignment with that recommendation that was made in the Isabel paper where they, talked. It was a Southeast Wild Turkey Working
Mm-hmm.
Group that put that together, and they talked about the earliest possible opening date to align with this population process, if it's
Mm-hmm.
what's occurring, um, would be peak nest initiation. And they said even more conservative approach would be to move it all the way back to peaks, the median incubation date.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think almost everyone would agree that not starting to hunt the bird until late April would just, it would probably result in losing a lot of turkey hunters. And the ones that are remaining, I think, would probably get very politically active in trying not to make that happen
Mm-hmm.
because that's such a significant loss of opportunity.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be palatable to hunters at all. But just kind of circling back to make that point, it is possible that the treatment, in this case being the season opening delay, was not sufficient to elicit a response in the Mississippi study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, another thing that I think maybe this is the time to put it in there. One thing that they all agreed on, and I think we both do, is that harvesting 80% of the gobblers right before they're doing all this, that's probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
But uh, the interesting thing that you just highlighted from the Mississippi study is they didn't actually see a decrease in the harvest.
Right.
The
Right.
same number of birds got harvested. It just was in a
They just
different.
got harvested
Yeah, it was
later.
just 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
Um, so that is an interesting thing because if you were thinking about changing the season dates to try to modulate the hunting pressure in terms of how many
Hmm.
birds are getting removed, didn't seem to do that in that case.
Yeah. But if the important issue here is not necessarily the number of birds that's removed compared to when they are removed, it is good to know that moving the season date back does not result in a loss of harvest,
Mm-hmm.
right? So hunters are still potentially harvesting the same number of bird that should help with, maintaining satisfaction
Right, and
at least.
if I'm gonna tell you what, some of my most memorable birds, like 2 of the 3, that was a joke. uh, some of the most memorable birds that I've taken over the years, they were on fire. I mean, they were double and triple and quadruple gobbling. They were
Hmm.
they were going crazy.
Yeah.
And one of them I remember that song we heard him gobble almost as far as you can hear one gobble. And I
Hmm.
made a peep at him, enough to get him interested, and he ran.
Hmm.
Through, and it was through longleaf pine. It was a beautiful
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But he just gobbled while he didn't even stop. He's just gobbling and running.
Yeah.
Like I didn't even
Right.
know they would do that. It's just imprinted on my brain. Like I've never experienced such excitement because that thing, like he's ready to go. And
Hmm.
the whole point of that is speaking of that hunter satisfaction, some of that might come out of that delay, like Adam was saying, that
Yeah,
the hunters did hear the same individuals gobbling more because they got to that point where they were super hot before they were taken. So
exactly. And I don't have any data on that here in Alabama, but for this spring 22 season, Alabama implemented an opening date delay for the first time in a while. I say in a while. I don't know if they've done it before or not, but they implemented a delay in season date opening. And I talked to several hunters that said that they felt like the birds were gobbling harder on opening weekend than what they were accustomed to. And these are guys that are very avid turkey hunters, and that they did seem to be more responsive to calling.
yeah.
So I mean, maybe
Well,
those
that
are some silver
yeah.
linings of you do take away some opportunity, but
Well,
there's silver linings to that as well.
and I think that's important to think about. That some of this is hunter satisfaction, some of it's biological, and we're trying to weigh those
Yep.
things. And I can see personally, as a hunter, I kind of want there to be a lot of gobblers all over the place when they're going crazy.
Hmm. Yeah.
So,
Right.
like, if I need to not hunt this Saturday and instead go next Saturday, but next Saturday they're going to melt the woods,
Yeah.
like, I'm okay with that, you know?
Yeah. Exactly. And you don't have to worry about in that scenario boogering up the birds before they're actually receptive.
Yeah.
They figure out pretty quickly when the hunt's on.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that. So why not just wait until they're primed for it?
Right.
Instead of exposing them to that pressure.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think, at least from it seemed like that they all agreed on that point, that there may be some hunter satisfaction benefits. At least
mhm.
I didn't hear anybody say anything that made me think they wouldn't be in line with that. Uh,
Yeah.
and I can relate to that as a hunter. So I think really the question is the timing, a negative influence or even a detriment to the productivity?
Yeah.
And that's where I think we still have some uncertainty. We
Right.
really need to try to address, and all those guys, they are, and we are.
Right.
That's one of the principal things that we're very interested in with the Florida turkey work that we're starting up too.
Sure.
So I think it's of central interest, and we're all trying to address it. It's one of those things that's really difficult to address, and the whether or not that timing is negatively influencing the productivity, I think is something that we really need to focus on and try to figure out.
Right. And so circling back to one of the topics that we talked about just a little while ago, when you asked me if I could think of a reason why it would take, multiple years for the birds to respond to a delay in the season opening, um, my answer was generally no. I can't really see why that would take multiple years, and especially like in Mississippi where they've given them 4 years. You think it would have
Mm-hmm.
happened by then?
Yeah, and I
And
was a little
then
bit worried about the sensitivity on that one,
yeah,
but then I remembered because their source of recruitment was from the poult. I mean, not poults, the jakes, not from
yeah,
fallen poults.
sure,
But
sure,
then I
but
remembered that Mike said that the males don't disperse very far, so they actually are the ones that should have been pretty much resident based on that.
right, right,
But
yeah,
go ahead.
that makes
Sorry.
sense. Well, I mean, the point that I was going to make is that you would expect to see. I think you would expect to see a fairly rapid response, but one thing that Craig shared was that they didn't see a shift in median incubation dates, and then Mike also shared that they haven't seen any difference in the median incubation date on the Savannah River site, and that population that has been unhunted for many, many years is still the same as their adjacent or proximal site that is hunted,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe that other site is a wildlife management area, so it's fairly intensively hunted. And so in neither of those instances are they seeing a shift in response to that season delay. And furthermore, one of the caveats that I mentioned about the Mississippi study was that the delay was only till April 1, so it's still a couple weeks out from initiation of nesting. But in the Tennessee study, Craig said that they delayed the season in those experimental counties to middle of April, April 14th through 15th,
Mm-hmm.
and that aligns really well with the median initiation date for hens in that area. So
Yep.
they did take the recommended approach by that document that was put forth by
Mm-hmm.
the Southeast Wild Turkey Working Group, and they still didn't see a shift
Yeah. So in other
in
words,
average initiation
the
dates.
Mississippi one didn't delay it all the way to the time that sort of
Mm-hmm.
being proposed as the key
Mm-hmm.
time, but the
Yeah,
Tennessee one did.
it did. Yeah,
So yeah, that's an interesting point. And then they were tracking some of those more traditional metrics of production in the Tennessee one.
sure.
I think the problem there is that it hasn't. We've only had 2 or 3 years of post data. I think they and
Right. Yeah. 2 years.
yeah. So
2 years post
and they
delay.
have a third one planned, and I know that
That's
they
right.
may even have a fourth one.
Right.
So I know Craig is he didn't say it on the air, but I think he's working on trying to get a fourth year lined up as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
it's like everything with us, we've got to figure out how to fund these things, and that sometimes it's tricky,
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
especially long term stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's hard for a state, and I understand where they're coming from totally, to commit to, and I think there may be even some stipulations in the federal funding that they use to match
Mm-hmm.
for these types of research projects as to how long they can fund a given project for.
Right.
I think it's, a 5-year timeline or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing that we discussed pretty extensively with both Craig and Adam that was really interesting to me was these patterns in population growth and population decline relative to the timing of restocking efforts.
Mm-hmm.
That was super interesting because, over the past couple years, as I've started to think more and more about this whole issue, one of the things that I've found very perplexing is that so many, the declines in harvest that so many states are experiencing are so closely aligned chronologically with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's had me thinking, what is the one issue, what is the one change biologically that occurred in that time period that could be affecting all these populations simultaneously? And so my mind immediately goes to something related to disease or predation, or did we have a big season date change that coincided with that time period? And the answer to that one is no. And I feel like the population trajectory relative to timing of restocking is the first hypothesis that I've ever heard that makes some sense to me.
Yeah. I'm
And
with
you
you.
know what I'm talking about with that?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You remember the specifics?
Well, I don't remember the actual numbers specifically, but the general idea is that the declines sort of correspond to what we would expect on that logistic curve. I try to say carrying capacity curve because I don't
Yeah.
know that I think that resonates with people probably better than aren't scientists. But
Yeah.
that carrying capacity curve, if you restock a population, you'd kind of expect this really rapid growth in population size, almost exponential. And then that would eventually hit some maximum, it kind of overshoots what is sustainable. And then you'd see a correction where you'd have a decline, and then it would kind of hover around that line.
Yeah. And most people think about that with deer populations. And the issue with deer populations is they're a large herbivore, and their herbivory, their foraging behavior can impact carrying capacity of their own habitat. They can decrease habitat quality by selecting for the most preferred plants and essentially creating localized extinction of those high quality forage plants. But turkeys don't do that. So, the way that I typically explain this, if we talk about it in class, like to my students, actually, I talked to them about this very topic earlier this week, is, maybe it's something else with turkeys. There's another limiting factor besides forage.
Yeah.
For example, maybe it's just a lack of optimal nesting sites. And so we've got more and more hens being pushed out into areas that
Hmm.
aren't conducive to supporting a successful nest. And so you see nest success rates go down.
Well, I think that is an important point. We inherently, I actually just talked about this in my class too. For some reason, we think about food as being limited. That
Mm-hmm.
has to be the thing limiting them, or
Yeah,
predators.
right.
Either they're food, or if they are food, one of those two factors has to be what's limiting the population. And the fact of the matter is, it's not necessarily those two.
Right.
And I think that might be something that's kind of tricky with turkeys, especially when they have the vastly different needs at different life stages, and
Mm-hmm.
it's they also have a different structure in terms of their behavior and everything. There are lots of other factors that could become limiting, even though there's plenty of food around. Now,
Yeah,
I'm not saying that food isn't a problem. I'm just saying we shouldn't assume that that's the only problem.
sure.
So, but I think you're keying in right on that. Like, okay, I've heard Mike talk about this before, and he has tons of data on hen nests all over the place. But he talks about the hens won't nest next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you don't have that much nesting cover, and they don't like nesting near each other, well, then some of them are going to be out of luck. They're going to end
Yeah,
up nesting in really bad places.
yeah. And from a natural selection perspective, it makes sense for them to nest apart because, if a predator finds one nest and they're concentrated in an area, it's
Yeah,
probably going to find others.
yeah. Don't put all your eggs in one nest.
There's so Man, there's so many turkey puns.
Oh
There's
man.
so many.
Well, I think
Um,
that yeah,
so
that's some good, interesting stuff. And one thing that I wanted to kind of add to that to get everybody thinking about this, when we think about the hunting season pressure and frameworks and everything, and the fact that they've been in place in a lot of these places for a long time, decades long in some cases, where the
right,
season framework has essentially not changed. I was trying to think of some mechanisms for the declining poult per hen over decades, which
yeah,
I think from my, their work is pretty compelling on that, showing a pretty clear trend in a lot of places where
mm-hmm,
poults per hen have been declining. And I was trying to think, what mechanistically could the hunting season do? How could it cause that pattern? Because I would
mm-hmm,
expect, based on if the season was such that we had an intensive harvest right before the breeding and it initiated that cascade of events, I would have expected that, we would have had pretty high poult per hen, but then all of a sudden we kind of hit this threshold where that harvest got too high, and then it would really sharply decline, and then it would
mm-hmm,
stabilize at some really low rate in comparison.
mm-hmm,
Not, we had three poults per hen, and then that slowly declined over a decade, and that was two poults per hen, and then that slowly declined
mm-hmm,
for another decade, and then we bottom out at one. I wouldn't have expected
mm-hmm,
that pattern,
yeah,
but that is consistent with what you might expect in the density dependence thing.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So, in other words, if we kind of got up to near that density, we sort of get to that level where you should see productivity decline that's commensurate, where it sort of stabilizes around that. And then you may even see that steady decline if that line, whatever that carrying capacity was, if that line started moving down,
yeah,
which all of them talked about.
yep, they
If
did.
you move that
Ch-
carrying capacity line
changing
down,
lands,
yeah,
changing landscape, increasing human population.
exactly. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And it dawned on me while you were bringing this up a minute ago. Here's another really interesting take on this. I don't know what the rate of population growth is in all these different places, but I do, in terms of human population, I do know that they are different.
Mm-hmm,
So, like, I think Tennessee is probably the human population is growing more rapidly than Alabama, is my guess,
probably.
and Mississippi as well. But uh,
Florida's probably growing pretty fast.
Florida's really fast. North
Yeah.
Carolina is really fast. So my point is, I wonder if we could key in on that human effect of expansion. Like if you, what is the rate of population growth and the rate of the associated infrastructure infringing
Hmm.
on turkey habitat? And does that explain any of the variation that we're seeing in the timing of this stuff?
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to look at.
So,
Um,
and we have good data on that, like with census
right,
data. So,
right. But I think, Adam, talking to him, his argument was more along the lines of, how long it takes a reintroduced population to hit that carrying capacity. And what he specifically said is it seems like there's about a 20 to 30 year window after restocking when they boom. It's a
mm-hmm,
boom cycle for populations, and then they hit a peak and then they start to come back down. And he said that Mississippi has the benefit of hindsight in the sense that they restocked before almost anybody else. And I mean, I think Alabama was kind of right on their heels.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so they've seen some populations in certain areas around the state start to come back up already. I believe he said that.
mm-hmm.
I'm not as certain about that,
No, I
but
think you're right.
um,
We
yeah.
just for
And he
those
even
out there, we did go back and listen to these and try to
yeah,
take some notes, but it does get
sure,
hard because I think we spent
right,
over an hour with all of these people, and
yeah,
I mean it's sort of like trying to drink through a fire hose or something, like
absolutely,
they're saying so much stuff and we're wanting to key in on it, and they've already moved on
right,
3 topics down the road before we get to it. It's hard to
sure,
do it, so we went back and tried to take notes and really contemplate a lot of these things they're saying and try to summarize it, I guess,
right.
and then reflect on it. And that's why we're here today, trying to figure out, okay, based
How
on
does this all
this,
fit
yeah,
together?
based on all of this stuff we've heard, what does it seem like is going on? What can we make of it?
So Adam gave us an example from even within his own state of Mississippi. He said the trends seem to follow a pattern based on when restocking occurred in Mississippi, peaking first in the South where they started restocking,
Mm-hmm.
and then northern Mississippi restocked later and it peaked later. And then in addition to that, Craig mentioned that Kentucky, Virginia, and North Carolina, in that mid-Atlantic region,
Mm-hmm.
well, I guess, exclude Kentucky from that, but definitely Virginia and North Carolina, um, that their populations are still trending to increase, but they're increasing at a decreasing rate, and they'll probably see declines beginning soon.
Yeah.
So we've got, already one example of a population increasing over time and hitting some peak 20, 30 years later, within a state,
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi. And then we have other examples based on chronology of restocking across multiple states.
Yeah. That's a good
So that's
point.
really that's an intriguing pattern that I was totally unaware of up until when we recorded those
Yeah.
episodes the other day.
One of the things that kind of is resonating with me is that, obviously as a scientist, I get really kind of excited about hypotheses, but essentially we have competing hypotheses here that are testable, and I like that,
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
because I was just thinking of those same states, and it was like, wow, okay, North Carolina, the restocking was relatively late, and they're on the incline, but that, at least around the research triangle area, that is one of the most rapidly growing human populations on the planet. I mean,
Hmm.
it's crazy
Yeah.
fast. I lived there for 5 years, and it had changed immensely in that time. And that's an interesting thing that, those, not in every area are those two hypotheses necessarily positively correlated. Like we literally may have
Yeah.
areas where we have a different time since restocking and pattern in human populations. I wonder if we overlaid that also with another competing hypothesis that I think Craig emphasized the most,
Yep.
with predators. Everybody wants
Hmm.
to cast blame on predators, and they are very commonly identified as a major source of mortality at multiple life stages. In fact, the primary one at most of the time. Uh, And you know as well as I do, everybody out there is probably already mad at us because of our look at the literature on the trapping topic. But
Yeah.
uh, we may have situations where those three things don't overlap.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And I think what this, what all this really emphasizes to me is, we have I think it's part of our human nature to want to take sides. And on this particular issue, it seems like it's turned into you've got the habitat side, you've got the predator side, you've got the hunting regulation side.
mm-hmm.
And everybody identifies with these camps almost like they're political parties, right? But the reality is all three of those factors are having an effect on any given population to some degree,
Yeah.
right?
We may
They're
not have
interacting.
the mechanisms just right,
Yeah,
or what the effect size of them are relative to one another, or
yeah,
how those effect sizes change in different
right.
contexts. But I think you're right that we can all agree that they're all having an effect.
Yeah. And so I think it's, our job as researchers and biologists to start to identify and, which of those is most important from one area to
Mm-hmm.
another so that we can start prioritizing, the leading issues for being addressed through management,
Yeah.
the specific to each of those areas. And that's one of the things that I mentioned in our conversation with Mike is that I think, maybe, I don't know, I guess I've somehow become a pseudo advocate for this, but coming from the deer world, as Adam clearly described us as deer
Yeah, you're
biologists,
the deer
right?
guy.
Yeah, you're the deer guys. He's not letting us in the circle. Um, is more localized management,
Yeah.
and that can be specifically tailored to given situations across the landscape. But you have to have a lot of data to be able to do
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think that's an inherent problem with turkeys that we don't have the level of data that we do on deer to make those kinds of decisions. And I think that's one limitation. It's also just not part of the culture.
Yeah,
But I agree with you. You know, in some states and in the hunting community certainly fusses about this plenty, and I'm one of them. Some of the states are, you know, with other hunted species, they're managing it at such a fine scale it makes it very difficult to even know what you can do where.
mm-hmm.
When I went out west elk hunting, that was the case. Like I didn't know where I could
Yeah,
where I was allowed to step and not, and there's all these different things. And one side of the road you could do one thing, and the other side you couldn't. So, you know, it can get cumbersome.
and
But
you and I have both told each other stories about calling up biologists in other
yeah,
states and saying, "Can you tell me what license I need?"
yeah. Well, that's exactly right. Like we're literally like calling the turkey coordinator to figure out what we can do turkey hunting wise, and you know, when we go to a different state. So I certainly can see why there might be some resistance to that, but it would make a lot of sense. Like in the case with Adam, if we have pockets in the state that have never had as many turkeys as they have, and they're going, you know, they're just going rampant. And why
Mm-hmm.
would we manage that necessarily the same as a three county area, you know, 150
Yeah,
miles away that they're near local extinction?
right,
Like those are two different scenarios, and we more, you know, we've been managing them more at the state level for this
right.
species. You know, some states have a little bit of variation, but uh, you know, we've been painting with a pretty broad brush in terms of what the season frameworks look like in general for this
Yeah,
for turkeys.
and I think Missouri is one of those states that's split their turkey seasons into more well-defined zones.
Yeah,
And
I'm.
I may be incorrect, but I feel like I looked at a map of Missouri pretty recently, and it was fairly broken up in terms of
Mm-hmm.
season regulations.
Yeah, and in Florida we have, you know, the early season down south, but uh, that's I think one important thing is this. You know, the state agencies have to think about what they can effectively do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that
Right.
they can do is influence when and how much and how many people are allowed to take.
Right.
And that's an important thing for us to consider. Is they're trying to do they're trying to wield the wand, so to speak, that they have at their disposal.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we don't have perfect data to make those decisions. And that we need to think about that. The other thing, and I think you brought it up initially when we were talking to Mike. I can't remember which one, but I think all of them agreed uh, when uh, when we think back to it. Everybody agreed that habitat improvement can make a big difference at the local
Yep.
level for
Yep.
turkey productivity.
Yep.
And I think that's an important thing for us all thinking about this and what we can do individually. Not only can you affect how many birds you're
Yep.
harvesting or whatever, but uh, the other thing that a lot of people have access to is manipulation of what the vegetation communities look like on their
Yeah.
properties and
Yeah.
trying to create a more conducive thing.
Yeah. Can I give you a quick rundown of the habitat issues that each of our three interviewees brought up that stood out to me?
No, I don't think so.
I'm going to do it anyway.
Please do.
So yeah, I mean, they, like you said, they all had that in common. They mentioned habitat as a major factor influencing populations, and uh, the thing that Craig said that stood out to me was that 45% of the nests in their study, and just for uh, reiteration's sake, they monitored 600 nests. Okay,
Wait,
so
how many
45,
zeros?
600,
Two
600.
two zeros on there. So that is a huge sample size.
Yeah. And they found that almost half, 45%, were located in cover types that comprised in total 7.5% of the landscape. So they had 3% of the landscape in early successional, which is like old field, like true open environment. It's got an herbaceous understory or herbaceous cover. There's no overstory, just herbaceous cover. And then 4.5% was shrubland.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where 45% of nests were
So
located. And nest success was higher in those areas too.
Even though a large portion of them got mowed up. Remember,
Yeah,
he said
that was the other thing,
12% of
right?
the nests got
12%. Just park your mower and you can increase nest success by 12%.
Yeah. Well, I
Um,
think there's a couple of things about that. One, we got to do better. Like,
yeah.
we need more of the landscape to be that, and that's something that all of us can work toward, is trying to do that. The other thing is, okay, early succession or shrubland. Well, that's what we failed to mow this year, and what we failed to mow
Mm-hmm.
last year too.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And not only were there a lot of nests that were directly mowed and lost because of
Mm-hmm.
that, but we have this exceedingly small proportion of the landscape where almost half the nests are going. Like that is a
Yeah.
huge selection margin right there.
Yeah.
And then, we're going in and mowing and putting the additional pressure, even if you're not mowing them during nesting, removing that cover for, uh, for next year or whatever, like that can still be an issue. And I think Craig
Mm-hmm.
even keyed in on it being a problem during the dormant season,
Yeah.
when birds are using it for cover then. So I think that's a pretty important point that I definitely wanted to emphasize, obviously, since I jumped in here and kind of took over your.
No, that's fine. That's totally fine. And the thing, this does not mean that you do not disturb those areas,
Right.
because what happens if you don't disturb them whatsoever is you lose your nesting
Yeah.
and you lose your brooding habitat. They require frequent disturbance. In fact, one thing that I've been telling a lot of people is, because I think this makes the point more salient, is to say that if you haven't disturbed an area in more than 3 years, you've lost your brooding habitat.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty accurate.
Or if you haven't disturbed it in 5, 6, 7 years, you've lost your nesting
Mm-hmm.
habitat. It's a little bit longer time frame.
Yeah, you can.
So we're
You can
not saying
decrease
don't
that by
disturb it.
20%. We're down here.
Yeah. So we're not saying don't disturb that. Just pay attention to how you disturb
Right.
it, with fire being better than
Well,
mowing.
here's it.
But fire still erases that cover for a period, and that's
Yeah.
why you make sure that you have a cover adjacent to it,
Mm-hmm.
that can be used for that purpose while that cover's
Well,
growing
you're
back.
you're keying in on a point that I wanted to also emphasize is removing all that cover is necessary to maintain it. But when you remove all that cover and it was only 7% of the area that was available
Yes.
anyway, like you almost can't disturb it without removing all of it. And
Yeah.
that's really where you know, the intersection of these problems is coming together. You
Sure.
have to disturb them, but when it's such a small portion of the landscape, you're basically disturbing all of it. So then
Yeah.
you have to, by default, have gaps in the
Yeah. And
availability of it.
absolutely, and we really don't know how much of that habitat type we need for turkey populations to function
Yeah,
optimally.
Adam brought that up that we don't know what that
But
number is.
the number that I've been throwing around is like I would like to see a landscape have at least like 25 to 30%,
Hmm.
suitable nesting and brooding cover,
Yeah.
across the landscape. And then that gives you the flexibility, assuming it's not a exceedingly small property, that starts to give you the flexibility to disturb a portion of it one year and a portion of
Hmm.
it the next, or even 2 years down the road.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point of emphasis that at the local level, we as landowners and land managers, turkey enthusiasts that want more turkeys, that's something that we can influence individually and
Hmm.
collectively have a big impact at a larger scale. But you can definitely
Yeah.
have a big impact on your own local scale, especially if two or
Yeah.
three landowners that have a pretty good chunk of land get together and start
Right.
doing that. You can have a big
Yeah.
impact on it just from the habitat alone. Now,
Right.
I do want to talk about predators a little bit here as well from a few different contexts. One, another thing that has changed in this landscape is not just that we're declining in the amount of area for turkeys, it's also declining in quality. And I think Mike
Hmm.
said that something along those lines, but the, the that isn't just like a decline in how much food there is or how much nesting cover there is. The conflicting issue there is it is also becoming more conducive to a bunch of our problematic predators.
Hmm.
So we're potentially having an increase in predators in less space, which itself is probably problematic, but the overlap in what turkeys are having to use and what raccoons are using is probably
Yeah.
increasing as
Yeah.
well. And I don't think people really think about that contextually. Uh, I think it's important to think about specifically, okay, not only is it declining in quality for hiding a nest, but it's also
Hmm.
becoming more conducive for raccoons. Now let's turn that around. Improving it for nesting and brooding will commensurately also decrease its value to the predator, in this case, raccoons.
Hmm.
We're just using that as an example. So just by addressing the habitat, you can also address the predation, not just by making it easier or more difficult to find, but also by making
Yeah.
it less conducive for that and potentially leading to declines of the predator itself on that landscape. And I think that's been demonstrated fairly well with some of the telemetry stuff with raccoons in particular, but also I believe with a couple of other predators.
Hmm.
So that's without even touching a predator trap. We can also,
Yeah.
improve a suite of things biologically in terms of the accessibility for turkeys on one side, and also decrease the value on the other side for the predator. And I think that's important. Now,
That's the kind of thing that gives me pleasant dreams at night,
yeah.
Marcus.
So we're the habitats addressing both at the same time, and I think they all in their own ways agreed with that line of thinking. The other thing that I think is we need to revisit is we've talked about predation and the role of predation and trapping, and the literature we have emphasizes remarkably weak on
Hmm.
how what the effect size that you could expect from trapping is, and even what intensity you need to do it at, and all those things. And everybody throws tomatoes at us and everything. But I mean, that's a pretty objective look at the literature. Like, it's weak.
Yes. Yeah.
But one thing that's been pretty consistent, and Craig really emphasized it, and when we were talking to him, is there are people who are really well respected, who know much more about turkeys than I do, who say that same kind of thing, and a lot of landowners as well, that when we've gotten the habitat together, adding trapping into that can have, reap huge rewards. They always caveat, it seems like, when they always say both. And I
Yeah.
agree with that. You know, don't try to get rid of all the predators if there's nowhere to nest anyway. Like,
Right.
that's not the leaky hole in the bucket, so to speak. But all of them seem to agree for the most part. And Craig, I think, emphasized it, that adding the predator trapping on top of the habitat can reap a big reward. The problem that you and I
Mm-hmm.
have is we haven't demonstrated that well in the
Yeah.
literature, and it's shocking to me. And I have hesitation, especially given the implications of that. And it's also something that's not really practical at large scales like the state agency's not going to do that. Like, that's not a
Yeah.
practical thing. It's not digestible. But at the local level, we need to know what the relative role is, because it's another tool that we potentially have in the toolbox at the local scale to influence
Mm-hmm.
how many turkeys there are. And ultimately, I think we need to be addressing these things at both scales. That was a
Yeah.
really long rant for me to
No,
basically
no, no.
say we need more
I think it was
data.
spot on.
We need more data on both of those things, but
Yeah.
don't think just because human populations are growing rapidly and we're losing turkey habitat, that doesn't mean that you can't locally really impact
Yeah.
positively or negatively the turkey population.
Yeah.
Like, you can have a big effect, and you can have a lot of turkeys in your area.
And Adam did a really good job giving us a measure of that effect. So everybody, you hear about what Craig mentioned relative to the selection of where they nested and the nest success. But if you really want to catch a hunter's ear, you start talking about harvest densities and how many birds you can sustainably harvest on a per acre basis.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that statewide, their average is a harvest of one turkey per about 1,200 acres,
Mm-hmm.
1,200 acres statewide. But he says that on their clubs that he works with in Mississippi, on the best managed property, they're killing a bird per 250
Yeah.
acres. And he indicated that
Five,
it was being done
right.
sustainably.
5 times as many birds.
Yeah, 5 to 6 times as many gobblers harvested per area, probably thanks to their investment in turkeys.
Yeah. Some of the most well managed properties, they're
Yeah,
probably not mowing their nest or their openings. Uh, we like to joke about that, but it really is. I mean, it's become I don't know if it's become or it's always been, but it is a principal way across a large portion of the landscape that early succession is maintained in early succession.
mm-hmm.
Craig says that, all these guys are talking about that. I see that everywhere I go. And people
Yep,
get upset with you if you suggest they shouldn't get on the mower.
right. Oh, I know. Um, and that's what another point that Adam made is he thinks the solution at the end of the
This
day
is
is
stop
more
mowing.
brooding habitat. No, it's more
Yeah. Well, I think,
we're gonna get John Deere after us here pretty soon.
yeah.
But
They
he
are
even
not a
made the point.
sponsor, by the way.
He even made it a point to say that, and you asked him to repeat this statement, but he didn't hear you because he was
He was in his
he
groove.
was down the
I
road.
didn't
He was
push it because
going.
I was letting him go.
He was going, but you asked him to repeat it. But what he said when I went back and listened to it is that essentially all game birds, didn't he say all game birds east of the Mississippi are declining?
Well, I asked him to repeat it.
I, well, he mentioned quail.
Mhm.
Um, he mentioned ruffed grouse, pheasants, uh, all declining because they've lost nesting and brooding habitat.
Yeah. No, I'm pretty sure that's what he said. Yeah. And that was why I was
Yeah.
like, whoa, wait, what?
Yeah. Because I'd never thought about it from that perspective.
Yeah, I haven't either. And that's why I wanted him to repeat it and kind of mull it over and let's extract that because he really is super knowledgeable about a bunch
Yeah.
of game species. He did a lot of work with quail before he went into that turkey coordinator position. You know, he's a really great guy and really knowledgeable about a bunch of things. And when he said that, I was like, man, I need to pick his brain about that.
Yeah.
But he
And
the ship was going too fast and it
yeah.
was already on its way.
No.
So
Yeah. And I'm kind of embarrassed that I haven't thought about it that way because I even present a figure, and I'm almost positive that I took that figure from a paper that was published out of Mississippi that shows trends in populations for northern bobwhites alongside trends in populations for several early successional specialist songbirds,
mm-hmm.
and they're all going the same direction. And I show that in my class to make the point that, you know, predation is a part of what's going on with these birds, but it's also, you know, when you see a guild of species, this group of species that all have similar habitat requirements declining at the same time, you know, that points you back every time to it being a habitat issue.
Yeah. And I think to say that in a different way or more directly or I'm not sure how I'm adding to what you just said, but another way to think about that is okay, we all these early succession obligates and early succession assisted species that have
Mm-hmm.
some key component of their life history.
Facultative.
Yeah, there you go. Uh, to have all of those with that happening at the same time, that's not because there's more raccoons in the fields. It's because
Yeah.
there's not any good early succession by and large across
Right.
the landscape. Like that,
Right.
that's what drives that kind of pattern. And not to say that, you know, having less of it and more raccoons can't complement one another to be
Sure.
detrimental. But,
Sure.
you know, that is a symptom of a broader problem. And no individual is going to solve all that at once. But we need to all be thinking about it because that's something,
Mm-hmm.
you know, having a few high quality brood patches on your property is something that a lot of landowners can accomplish. Like just
Mm-hmm.
don't plant it or don't mow it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Get rid of the the carpet, as Craig likes to
Yeah.
say,
Right.
you know the mat forming grass, and then
Yeah.
you know let it move into a foreblend. I've been trying to say
Yeah.
foreblend because everybody always says grassland, and I think that's a misnomer. And Craig has been kind of beating that into my head for years and years now. And one time he said foreblend because
Well, I
we
had a
say
student one
grassland, but
time
you
that
don't
I
actually want it to be dominated in grass. You know, he said the you kind of extracted out him a specific number, and I think he said 30% grass cover. If you're over
yeah.
that, even if it's native warm season grass, it's not what you're looking for.
And I feel like he keeps cutting down that number more and more. He used to be, I feel like he used to be around 50%. And then
That's what
a
I
little
thought he
while
was
ago, I
going to
heard
say was
40.
50, but lots of things have changed over the years. And actually,
Yeah.
you know, I don't recall which year it was, but I was working with him essentially 2007 through 2009 with my master's, and it was, you know, I mean, it was like drinking through a fire hose then too. I didn't really have much resonate because it was just there's so much going on. He's so knowledgeable about all that. But there were some things that I remembered, particularly related to forest stand improvement and a couple of things related to food plots and some things with early succession that I kind of had, you know, a scaffolding of the way I thought about them that came from working with him. And last year I was, or maybe in the year before, I was up in Tennessee with him. We were going and looking at one of the experiments we're working on, and did some turkey hunt together. And he had changed on one of those things. I think it was related to forest stand improvement. And I said, "Well,
Hmm.
Craig, that's not what we learned about back in the day." And he's like, "Well, we didn't know what the hell we were talking about back then." He was like, "I did all this stuff," and you know, he's changing
and
with his data.
and that's how a lot of this is, you know, with science. And I think, the world got a front row seat to all this, and, how science evolves over time, sometimes at a very rapid rate with
Hmm.
the COVID pandemic, regardless of how you think it was handled or your thoughts on the whole thing, whatever, we saw very different stories, and some of it was politicized and
Hmm.
that muddied the water. But the stories changed, it seemed like, from one
Yeah.
week to the next
Even
because
yeah, even from the same.
governments were throwing
Yeah.
yeah, governments were throwing so much money at the research, and the state of the knowledge was constantly
Yeah.
changing.
Well,
Um,
even I kind of kept my finger on the pulse of the literature on it, where it's peer reviewed science, and it was
right.
like the scientists were all arguing with each other.
Yeah.
And it was really
Yeah.
cool to watch because some of them, like, there would be a paper published in the Lancet, and then that paper would get 500 responses.
Yeah.
And then all of those
Right.
would get a bunch of responses. And they're literally like having a real time conversation about it. And you're right. Now,
Yeah.
with technology, like what we're using right now, it's really visible to people. And I guess we're
Yes.
sort of trying to do the same thing with turkeys because there's, one, it lets everybody understand that all of this stuff is evolving. Like, we're not certain on what, all these mechanisms. I think one thing that we can all agree with is we want turkeys. They need habitat to produce, and they need to not get eaten.
Hmm.
So, we're kind of focusing on
And
the,
we can't shoot them all before they breed.
yeah, yeah. If you shoot all of the males and there aren't any to breed, that's going to be a big deal. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter really when the timing is then, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so, there's some uncertainty here, and then we have other things that are sort of like pillars that we're building, that we're building on these pillars, but there's a little bit of uncertainty on exactly how to maximize our success in all these different areas. And
Right.
we're sort of trying to put a spotlight on that, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that's been very frustrating to everyone, related to this whole situation, or maybe I'm just speaking, from personal experience, but with the habitat issue, you know, people are seeing declining populations, and that's very concerning.
Hmm.
Those who are most concerned are the landowners and the passionate turkey hunters who no longer have the ability to even hunt a turkey on their property.
Hmm.
They've lost all the turkeys there, and habitat change doesn't happen immediately. And that's oftentimes the reason why, particularly state agencies, look at what can we change right now today
Hmm.
to try to stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
And so that's why they're pulling some of those levers. But longer term, we need to definitely be looking at, of course, understanding that whole process better. I mean, that's been the basis of this entire conversation we've had today. But I think, one thing that Mike said that resonated with me was that we need to think of ways to incentivize landowners to manage for turkeys at the local level too.
Hmm.
And we've done that for other species of plants and animals. So,
Uh,
why not do it for turkeys too?
yeah, I think that's a really important point. And again, like you said, although that whole guild of species will benefit.
Sure.
We need programs like the early succession in particular. I've been on that one for a while now because I just see it. I mean, it's just such a big problem, so
Hmm.
ubiquitously across the landscape,
Yeah.
and to the degree where
And
I
it's
tell
because it's
people,
labor intensive.
yeah, I tell people this is what you're trying to get, and they don't even know what I'm saying, and then I don't even have any opportunity to show them because it doesn't
Yeah.
exist in the landscape.
Yeah.
And it's,
Yeah. Sure.
that's if we had programs that were helping landowners to do that instead of the alternative practices that it's being used for, or to offset the cost, so in other words, there could be lost opportunity cost as well with doing that.
Hmm.
If we could offset that somehow, uh, we could probably get a lot higher buy-in.
Yeah. Sure. I think that's a good point.
Yeah. Well, is there any other topics that we didn't get to on here? Again, because I read so slowly and I write so poorly. I'm not sure if I missed something in mine, but uh,
At least your voice sounds great
oh
today.
my gosh, isn't it? Yeah.
I think we've covered most of the stuff that I had highlighted in my notes. Um, so I guess that, I mean, I feel like we just had a pretty good summary,
Mm-hmm.
discussing, what challenges we're facing and what opportunities there are. Um, I guess to loop back to the beginning of this conversation, this is by no means a settled topic. I mean, this
Yeah.
this episode series, I think, hopefully, at least for me, it was very enlightening. I hope it's very enlightening for our listeners. But don't take us wrong in that we're concluding that, one way or another about season dates. Our objective with this was just to establish what is the state of the knowledge
Mm-hmm.
relative to that and the weight of the evidence of season dates playing a role in turkey population growth rates,
Yeah.
and kind of talk a little bit about some of the uncertainties that we still need to address. And like I said, at the end of the day, I absolutely think additional research in this area is merited.
Yeah. It's a really important thing. And I think I said it with Mike, but I don't want us to have to go 25 years down the road and figure out whether or not we did the right thing. Right. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the
Yeah.
values of doing these things experimentally and measuring that response and then trying to make decisions based on that as you don't have to kind of try and see. And then if it's going to take three
Yeah.
decades to correct, well, we don't need to wait that long to see if it didn't.
Yeah.
So,
But I do feel like we are getting to the point where we're going to have data here pretty soon that's going to give us a pretty good indication if this is going to work. At the statewide level, many states are changing their season openings in response to this. Hopefully, they're continuing to collect data consistent with the way that they did it
mm-hmm,
before they implemented those changes, so that we can assess those indices like hunter harvest to see if the trends are reversing and you're
sure.
starting to see a stabilization or increase of populations. And then you've got people like Adam Butler in Mississippi and Mark McConnell and Dana Morin at
Mm-hmm,
Mississippi State that are working with him on that research project. You've got the research project that Craig Harper and Dave Bueller are leading up in Tennessee. And then you've got Mike leading that work,
mm-hmm,
where they're doing it in South Carolina, looking at comparing the unhunted site to the hunted site that's close by. So all that, cohesively or collectively, however you want to say it, should start painting a pretty clear
mm-hmm.
picture of what's going to happen in response to these changes in the pretty near future.
Yeah. That's really good. Really good point. And I'm glad, we're trying to do the
Yeah.
same thing in Florida. So, yeah, really good stuff. Um, One thing I just wanted to impress upon the audience, we don't always hit the right topics or we don't always explain everything. And, sometimes as scientists, we might miss it. If you have questions about it or you have a thought process or whatever, please share that with us because we're going to use it to, kind of guide us through
Hmm.
this. And this is the kind of topic where I could see us coming back to it, especially
Yeah.
since there's a lot of ongoing work. Like, that some of these things are going to change. Some of them are going to get published and there's more certainty around them. So we're probably going to revisit stuff. And maybe we didn't ask a question that you all are wondering about to one of these people. So share that with us and we will definitely try to incorporate it into the show. And
Hmm.
along those same lines, share this with other folks. Ultimately, this is about getting information out to people and having our audience help us do that is
Yeah.
necessary to maximize impact, especially, if you're one of those landowners that is isolated by the land management around you or the turkey management around you, there could be a lot of benefit from making sure those people are listening in and taking in some of these concepts that may drive some action to promote some real change and help everybody out. So ultimately, if we can get everybody thinking about that, I think that's one thing we all agree on is that we can move the needle collectively. It's
Hmm.
really a question of how to get us all to to move on it.
Yeah. And that's the whole intent of this
Yeah.
podcast. And we hit some of the wave tops related to things like habitat management and predation, and some of the things we spoke on related to that may have intrigued you or confused you. Maybe you don't understand what we were talking about, or like what you were saying, Marcus. A lot of landowners don't even understand what early succession
Yeah.
means.
Or
So
maybe
we
you
will.
think we're wrong, which is
Yeah, that's true
with
too.
Will, that's pretty common occurrence. So
It is every day. Just ask my family.
yeah,
But we're going to be doing deeper dives on all those topics, to try to give you guys actionable information, telling you what we know, telling you what the literature, going back as far as we need to, says about it as well, and trying to be kind of a clearinghouse for that type of information to make you a more effective, turkey manager, and to hopefully pass the word along to others so that we can continue to meet this challenge,
yeah. Good points. Good stuff. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We really appreciate it. And yeah, we're going to keep going after these topics. So please keep listening, share it with your friends, rate the podcast, help us spread the word.
Absolutely. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.